Imagine getting a letter that tells you exactly how and when you're going to fail. Now imagine getting that letter 3 separate times and ripping it up every single time. That is exactly what happened inside the Soviet government. Hidden away from the public, 3 crucial reports landed on the desks of the men running the country. They weren't about tanks or bombs, they were about money, food, and giant economic mistakes. Each one warned that the country was heading for a complete disaster. Delivered right before the major crises of 1953, 1979, and finally 1991, these reports offered a clear way out. But the leaders in the Politburo didn't fix the problem, they simply chose to ignore the bad news. This is the story of the simple, huge errors they missed, and how 3 simple warnings doomed a superpower that thought it could never fail.
We all know how the Soviet Union ended. A televised flag lowering in 1991, decades of Cold War rivalry over, the world breathing a collective sigh of relief. But what if I told you that long before Gorbachev, long before the Berlin Wall fell, the men in charge, the powerful, untouchable Politburo, already knew the game was over? They had the proof, the data, the absolute certainty that their great socialist experiment was marching toward total collapse. They just chose to ignore the bad news. We're going deep into the Kremlin's secret history to uncover the 3 economic reports, memos, studies, cold calculations that landed on the desks of Soviet leadership in 1953, 1979, and 1991. These documents weren't about ideology. They were about money, resources, and debt. They were the fatal threads that connected 3 separate moments of crisis into one inevitable outcome. This isn't just a history lesson. This is a warning. This is the story of how 3 acts of economic denial doomed a superpower.
March 1953. Joseph Stalin is dead. The entire Soviet system is reeling. Suddenly, the brutal stability maintained by fear is gone, replaced by a desperate scramble for power between figures like Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Beria. But while the politicians were fighting for control, the economists were calculating the cost of Stalin's legacy. Under Stalin, the Soviet economy was a monster built on 2 things: heavy industry and terror. Everything was geared toward massive factories, military production, and prestige projects. But who was feeding the machine? The peasantry. They were trapped on collective farms, their output constantly skimmed, and their personal lives suffocated. This was the first, most fundamental flaw. The first warning didn't come from a radical reformer. It came from the system itself. The figures were delivered shortly after Stalin's death, as the new leaders sought an honest baseline. The findings were terrifying. The documents revealed that despite endless propaganda boasting of bountiful harvests, Soviet agriculture was a catastrophic failure. Production had barely risen above the levels of the Tsarist era, while the population had grown massively. The collective farm system was inefficient, unmotivated, and starved of investment. In simple terms, the nation could barely feed itself.
Here's the specific, damning proof. Economists showed that farmers' incomes were ridiculously low, sometimes just 1/10 of what an industrial worker earned. They had no incentive to produce more. The report explicitly stated that if they didn't immediately shift massive state investment from heavy industry, tanks and steel, to consumer goods and agriculture, food and clothing, the entire system would face chronic instability. The new leaders couldn't ignore this report entirely. The hunger was too real. Nikita Khrushchev, who eventually took charge, understood the danger. He raised procurement prices for farmers, canceled some back debts, and allowed a slight increase in private plots. But here's the crucial denial. They did not change the fundamental system. They refused to admit that the centralized collective farm model itself was the problem. They made minor tweaks, a bandage on a gaping wound, but kept the core socialist doctrine intact. They were willing to spend money, but not admit a systemic ideological flaw. The result? A temporary fix. Hunger lessened, but the foundational economic problem persisted. They had papered over the first crack, ensuring that the necessary, painful reforms were delayed for decades. This meant that the failure of 1953 would simply be magnified by the time the next crisis arrived. Now jump forward to the late 1970s. This is the era of Brezhnev and stagnation. The Soviet Union looked powerful on the world stage, satellites, massive armies, and détente with the West. Moscow was awash in optimism, largely fueled by one thing: oil. Following the 1973 oil crisis, the price of oil soared. Since the USSR was a major oil exporter, particularly from the rich fields of Siberia, hard currency, dollars and pounds, flooded into the Kremlin. They suddenly had money to buy Western grain, fund the vast military, and keep consumer promises just good enough to prevent unrest. The system felt safe. Too safe.
While the Politburo was high on petrodollars, a team of economists, led by figures like Abel Aganbegyan, who would later work with Gorbachev, was running the terrifying numbers. Their report, circulated quietly among the elite, sounded a powerful alarm. The Soviet Union had become fatally dependent on high oil prices. The report detailed what's known as the Dutch disease. Because oil money was so easy to get, they stopped investing in productive, innovative non-resource industries. Factories were running on ancient equipment, consumer goods were shoddy, and technology was falling decades behind the West. The reports explicitly warned that if oil prices dropped, or if the West made technological advancements that made Soviet oil less competitive, the entire budget would implode. The report demanded an immediate, painful shift: diversify the economy, invest heavily in high-tech machinery, and allow some elements of market competition to drive innovation. Essentially, they asked the geriatric Politburo to sacrifice their oil revenue comfort blanket and embrace change. This time, the denial wasn't a compromise, it was inertia. Brezhnev's Politburo valued stability above all else. They saw the oil money as proof that their socialist system was working perfectly. Why rock the boat? They dismissed the report as alarmist. Why? Because implementing the recommended changes meant admitting that the entire Soviet economic planning structure, the heart of their ideology, was obsolete. It meant risking social unrest by closing inefficient factories or allowing unemployment. It was easier to take out a few more massive loans from the West, pay for Western grain, and keep the lights on with cheap oil money.
The report was filed away. They doubled down on oil exports. The disastrous consequence? When oil prices plummeted in the mid-1980s, largely due to increased non-OPEC production and Saudi Arabia's decision to flood the market, the Soviet budget was suddenly hemorrhaging billions. The lifeline they relied on, the one they were warned about in 1979, was cut. This economic collapse made Gorbachev's political reforms, perestroika and glasnost, not a choice, but a desperate necessity. By 1991, the Soviet Union was a patient in the ICU. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms had opened the lid on decades of systemic corruption and failure. The empire was unraveling, Eastern Europe was free, and Soviet republics were declaring independence. The economy wasn't just stagnant, it was shattered. Inflation was rampant. Food queues stretched for blocks. The central government had lost control of the supply chain. Everything was scarce: soap, sugar, shoes. The 1979 warning had come true with a vengeance. The budget deficit was astronomical, essentially paid for by simply printing money, making the inflation worse. The third warning was the shortest and most brutal. It was delivered in the context of the growing power of Boris Yeltsin and the radical reformers. This report was an explicit analysis of the fiscal crisis and the central bank's position. The data showed that the Soviet government's financial reserves were effectively zero. They had no gold, no hard currency, and no credit. More critically, the report detailed the total collapse of the command and control economy, the Gosplan, which was supposed to manage all production and distribution. Republics and regional leaders were hoarding goods and ignoring orders from Moscow.
The message was crystal clear. The Soviet state was financially bankrupt and functionally ungovernable. The only remaining option to prevent total chaos was a swift transition to a full, though painful, market economy and the immediate granting of autonomy, if not independence, to the republics to manage their own local economies. They needed to shed the expensive, useless central control. The reaction to this final, desperate warning was not a memo being filed away, but a violent attempt to seize power. In August 1991, a hardline faction of the Politburo, the KGB chief, the defense minister, the interior minister, staged a coup against Gorbachev. They represented the ultimate denial. They refused to accept the economic bankruptcy and the end of Central Communist Party control. Their goal was to roll back all reforms and forcibly restore the old, flawed system. They failed. Why? Because the economy they were trying to save was already dead. The populace, rallied by Yeltsin, had nothing left to lose. They'd already endured the failed promises of the collapsed system. The hardliners' political power dissolved because their economic foundation was already dust.
The final act of denial, the coup, was crushed in 3 days. By December 1991, the Soviet Union was formally dissolved. The third warning proved not just that the system was dead, but that any attempt to resuscitate it would be futile. Let's put the 3 warnings side by side. What connects 1953, 1979, and 1991? 1953, the agriculture lie. They refused to admit that centralized planning stifles incentive and cannot effectively feed a nation. They prioritized ideological control over human necessity. 1979, the oil trap. They refuse to admit that dependence on a single resource creates vulnerability and kills innovation. They prioritize short-term, easy comfort over long-term structural change. 1991, the bankruptcy. They refused to admit that the state's economic existence had ended. They prioritized the maintenance of central power over the simple reality of zero funds. The common thread is denial. The Politburo is presented with the facts by their own experts, facts backed by cold, objective economic data. But acting on that data would have meant admitting that the core premise of their political power, the supremacy of centralized communism, was a catastrophic failure. For decades, they kicked the can down the road. They papered over the cracks with political compromises, oil money, and police state power. But economic gravity is inescapable. Every delayed reform in 1953 and 1979 simply made the final breakdown of 1991 more painful, more chaotic, and more absolute.
So why does this matter now? Because the Soviet Union's collapse holds a brutal, universal truth for every government, every CEO, and every person in power today. When the numbers tell you your strategy is failing, you have 2 choices: deny the reality and maintain the political status quo, guaranteeing a bigger, more painful failure down the line. Face the facts and make the hard, politically unpopular choices necessary to survive. The Soviet Union chose denial. They believed their ideology was stronger than the laws of economics. They were wrong, and their downfall is proof that no amount of military might, no depth of secret police surveillance, can protect a government that refuses to listen to the brutal, undeniable language of money, debt, and economic reality. The 3 secret reports were not curses or prophecies. They were simply invoices, and in the end, the bill always comes due.